Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Hello, and welcome to this special series of Voices of Africa, where we're featuring leading actors in Africa's mining, minerals processing, and manufacturing sectors. This series is brought to you by Africa Practice, a leading Pan-African strategic advisory firm, the Hive Group, who are producers of the Investing in African Mining Indaba, and the African Minerals Development Centre, the African Union agency charged with supporting member states' mining policies. In this episode, my co-host Laura Nicholson and I are joined by John Magok, Programme Officer at the African Union Commission, who's going to tell us all about the African mining vision and the efforts being made by the AU to support member states to design and implement policies to add value to their mineral resources through processing and manufacturing. And we're joined also by Deshan Naidoo, the Managing Director of Afrivault, a firm that is building a gigafactory in South Africa. As we all know, Africa has notable deposits of minerals that are required for battery manufacturing. But for the most part, the continent is not considered as an investment destination for these gigafactories. Afrivault plans to change all of that, and in the process to contribute to intracontinental trade, job creation, skills development, and importantly, beneficiation. Over the course of this episode, you're going to gain more insights into the efforts of the African Union to support mineral-producing states in Africa, and also what it'll take to establish the African continent as a green mineral processing and manufacturing hub. So let me now hand over to my co-host, Laura, and she's going to fire away some questions at our guests. Over to you, Laura.
Many thanks, Marcus. Great to be here and so excited for this incredible opportunity talking about one of Mining Indaba's priorities for 2025 around green minerals processing and downstream value addition, and really looking forward to John and Deshan's contributions. Now, John, I thought we should start with yourself and around the African mining vision, which is something we all know about. It's been around for a while. And as we know, it actually aims to harness the continent's mineral resources for broad-based sustainable development. Now, John, can you give us an overview of how specifically it addresses green minerals processing beyond extraction?
Thank you very much, Laura, and good morning to you all. I'm John Johannes from the land of great abundance and Eden of diversity. That is the Republic of South Sudan. I'm currently working for the African Union Commission, Department of Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals as an expert on mineral resources development. Also, part of my work is to coordinate the implementation of the African Union Commodity Strategy, which is a flagship project of Agenda 2063. And it has three key pillars, that is mining, energy, and agriculture. I previously also worked in the same department. I joined in 2019, and I had opportunity to work in different files, especially the African mining vision and its implementation instruments. And that gave me also an overview of what the continent requires in terms of policy implementation and so on. Indeed, the African mining vision, as you mentioned, has been there for a while. And this policy is a Pan-African policy framework that established by the African Union heads of state and government in 2009, of course, through a combined network of initiatives at regional, continental, and global levels. And the aim is to transform Africa's mineral sector for sustainable development. As you may know, the main characteristic of the African mining vision is transparency, equity, and optimal exploitation of mineral resources to achieve sustainable growth and socio-economic development in the continent. And the vision is very clear. It is, fully integrated or aiming to integrate mining into single African market through downstream linkages into mineral beneficiation and manufacturing in the continent, and looking upward to the upstream linkages into mining, the capitals, and other services that are related to the mining operation. So the African Union in 2016 adopted the statute of the African Mineral Development Center to work ultimately to coordinate the implementation of the Africa Mining Vision at the national level and the regional level. But ever since, the institution is still having a lot of challenges in to fully be operational. We need to do more to ensure that the institution is up and running and it has all the necessary structures. But I believe the current interim team are trying to achieve just that, for us to have an institution that put together all the things. To conclude, the Africa Mining Vision, from my own view, is still an instrument that we rely on, because if we really need to achieve equitable energy transition, we need minerals, and we need not to mine them in the normal traditional way of extracting the raw material and export them outside the continent. Our approach is beneficiation in the continent, value addition that create jobs and opportunity to local community, and preserve and protect the environment. So those are our aspirations, and they are translated in all the documents that I mentioned. They are available, they are all online. Anyone who is interested to check can also check the African Union website or other website on the availability of all these documents.
John, thank you very much. What you've explained is a very complex process from the beginning to where we are now, a number of instruments in place, a number of policies that you've mentioned, and a number of hurdles as well that you've had to overcome. But I'm particularly interested to know, John, based on the story or the picture that you've painted, and I'm sure our audience will want to know the same, has the vision changed? What are the objectives, maybe the short-term objectives moving forward, and has the ultimate vision still on board? It's good to know that beneficiation, downstream value addition is very much a central point of what you're doing, but where are we in terms of progress, and how do you plan to expedite and get success to happen with regards to the AMV implementation?
The vision did not change. It is still remain the same, but we are saying it has to be agile in a way that it fits the current realities where there is advent of green minerals or critical minerals, and the electrification of our world to live in a better environment. It needs minerals. If you want solar panel today, you need lithium, you need cobalt, you need copper, you need all the element to put up those renewable technologies. So we are saying the vision is still relevant because it talks about mineral beneficiation in the continent, and that is something that we are yet to achieve by far. There is a development in different aspects and different countries in the continent, but we are not yet there. So what I was saying is the vision is still relevant, nothing changed, but we are yet to achieve its ultimate goal. And this is what need our cooperation. This is what need our collaboration as different institutions. When it comes to the institution that can deliver at member state, because African Union Commission is a policy organ of the African Union. It comes up with policies that can be introduced to member state. But those policies are implemented with technical institutions. Like the African Minerals Development Center. It's a technical institution that can be in the ground with member states and implement and see how AMV is relevant to countries that have abundant in minerals and working together with them. So we are saying for us to have a fit for purpose institution, we need to be at least ahead of our aspiration, where we encourage the member state to take interest from the institution like the African Mineral Development Center to deliver to their aspiration of the Africa Mining Vision. So I'm optimistic, Laura, in terms of Africa contribution to greener and sustainable world. But we don't want to do it as usual. We don't want to do business as usual, where Africa extract raw materials and export them the way they are. We are saying no. We need to add value into those minerals, and this is the foundation of having the Africa Mining Vision. And we are still in that. It is not easy, it is challenging, but we have to do it, and we have to do it collectively and with a purpose and determination.
Let me jump in here, Laura, and I'd like to bring in Deshan now. Deshan, John has told us about the importance that the AU attaches to domestic value addition and to increasing the contribution of African nations in critical minerals value chains. Of course, that's exactly what you're doing at Afrivault, and you're doing it in a very complex area of the value chain. You're building a lithium ion cell gigafactory in South Africa. I'd like to invite you to tell us about Afrivault, your ambitions, some of the challenges associated with bringing all of the components that are required for such a complex manufacturing project to materialize.
Thanks, Marcus. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast, and warm greetings to all your audience as well. I think the operative word that you mentioned there is extremely complex, and this is something that I've been facing over the last 2 years of trying to initiate this project. To give you some context, I started my career in finance, and my formal training is in economics and finance, and I spent the last 10 years as CEO of a high-volume automotive component manufacturing facility that we purchased out of business rescue and managed to successfully turn into a globally competitive 99% export-orientated business, producing critical engine parts from South Africa and exporting them to all parts of the globe. And through this process, we felt the same resistance that I'm now facing in my new project at Afrivault. But essentially, how does Africa become a globally competitive player in what is very much a red ocean territory or a highly competitive market of component manufacturing for the automotive industry? And I think there's quite a few unique selling points and competitive advantages that we take for granted as Africans. And one is the maturity of the manufacturing industry that we have in South Africa, particularly, as well as other African countries. So at Afrivault, whilst doing some work on the new energy vehicle policy implementation for the country, I realized that the mineral resources that we have on the continent, as well as the advanced manufacturing capabilities that we have in the automotive industry, really lends itself towards a vertically integrated solution for battery manufacturing. The skills that are required in battery cell manufacturing and battery assembly are not dissimilar from conventional manufacturing industries, specifically the automotive industry. So at Afrivault, our plan is to develop a gigafactory that supplies battery cells and battery packs to the battery energy storage industries, both at commercial, industrial scale, as well as utility scale, and now also looking towards electrifying heavy commercial vehicles and supplying battery packs into those industries. So there's a huge pressure on mining companies to decarbonize their value chain, and the transportation element of transporting ore from mine to port is a significant contributor to that carbon footprint. So in order to unlock this opportunity, it requires a multitude of factors to come together simultaneously. But I think the important consideration here is around investment in local infrastructure. And not only investment in local infrastructure, but also foreign direct investment into what is essentially a greenfield industry. In order to achieve this, there needs to be not only investment in production facilities, but also on the logistics networks that facilitate the movement of these raw materials, as I mentioned. And I think importantly, the development of special economic zones that provide a competitive advantage for foreign investors becomes an important consideration. The second point that I'd like to mention is around partnerships and collaboration. Now, Africa is not known to actually process these minerals to battery grade, and it is a very elongated process to go from extraction, concentration, processing to technical grade, processing to battery grade, and then using those raw elements in the downstream manufacturing of battery cells. And the truth is that globally, there is a shortage of intellectual property outside Asia when it comes to this. North of 95% all processing of minerals to battery grade occurs in China. And as a consequence, it is important for us to ensure that we have these intellectual property and technical partnerships with countries like in Asia, where they have perfected this model. I was fortunate enough to just finish a trip. I was in China and Hong Kong recently for FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Collaboration, as well as the South African Presidential Business Summit to China. And then I also presented Afrivault at the Belt and Road Summit in Hong Kong. And it was eye-opening to see the numbers and the quantum of investment that is being made into the Belt and Road Initiative. Asia is now realizing that the extract and export model in mining is no longer a sustainable solution, and a win-win partnership is important. That being said, they're looking at ensuring that there's value addition and beneficiation on continent or in country. And I think that talks very well to John's comments around the African mining vision and the African green mineral strategy. The final point in terms of unlocking domestic capability is very much on education and training. And globally, there is a shortage of skills when it comes to the processing of battery minerals and the manufacture of battery cells outside China. And the truth is that we have to develop these academic capabilities where there is bilateral exchanges of technology and information using and leveraging our academic institutions to develop this capacity locally. I think with regard to the environmental responsibility and social equity element that you mentioned, sustainable mining practices are paramount. In order for us to achieve a competitive advantage in this industry globally, we have to decarbonize our value chain. And given the solar irradiation roadmap, heat map that we have on the continent, as well as other reserves of wind and hydro, I think we have the opportunity to develop a sustainable industry, not only on the mining and processing side, but also on the downstream manufacturing. And the final point is on the community engagement. It is important to ensure that certain industries that are small, like artisanal and small-scale miners, are brought into the conventional value chain, and that is done in a very equitable and responsible manner when it comes to regulation and vetting. So in order to maximize the economic benefits, I think we've all spoken about the value addition that is achievable through processing. And this is clearly articulated by a study that was done by Bloomberg NEF, which focused on understanding what the current size of the market is for battery and energy mineral or transition minerals, and how can we unlock value addition and economic activity as we go further downstream to ensure beneficiation. Currently, Africa is very much focused on extraction, and that industry is roughly around a $7 billion industry. By going downstream all the way to electric vehicle assembly, we're able to unlock a potential market of north of $7 trillion. And as a consequence, I think that would lead to significant opportunities for positive externalities on job creation and alternate industries that are able to support this vision.
Thanks, Deshan. That's a pretty comprehensive picture you've presented, and a sizable opportunity to transform the continent from an exporter of raw materials with little value addition to a manufacturing hub. I'm interested to invite you to focus on the progress that you see at a continental level. Can you point us to examples of African nations that are being successful in increasing the amount of local mineral processing, beneficiation, and manufacturing using the continent's raw materials? I'd like also to invite you to speak specifically to battery precursors, because there have been announcements in the last 18 months that speak to the opportunity in DRC and Zambia to develop battery precursor manufacturing there in those two nations. But I'm not quite clear on progress that's being achieved there. Just generally, John and Deshan, can you paint for us a picture of progress in respect of critical mineral processing and specifically battery precursor manufacturing?
Thanks, Marcus. Happy to start. So as you point out, I think there is this perception that there is not a lot of activity. And I think that is a valid comment, given the scale of the opportunity and what is required to unlock this industry for Africa. That being said, there are sporadic opportunities and success stories that one would come across if they're deep in the roots, like Afrivault is in this process. But I think before that, just to take a little bit of a helicopter or macroeconomic picture to talk to the study that you mentioned that was conducted by the World Bank and a few other development financiers, which talked to, on the Lobito corridor, the cost of setting up and operating a battery precursor plant versus the cost in China, Europe, and America. And that came out to show that analysis or that pre-feasibility study showed that it is 1/3 of the cost to set up a battery precursor facility in Africa relative to those comparative countries. So again, that is a glaring opportunity. And I think the issue that we're having here on the continent is the fact that this is very much greenfield technology, greenfield industry, and as a consequence, attracting capital of this magnitude into essentially what is a dark continent for battery manufacturing. There is a disjoint in mandate fit financiers that are based in developed markets who are very much focused on trying to secure jobs and create economic activity along their own battery value chain in their countries. So that is the major issue. And I think that is the reason why we haven't seen the significant investment into the African continent. That being said, I'm seeing a huge shift in mentality and mindset towards looking at Africa in a more positive light. The Asia trip that I mentioned was the Forum on China-Africa Collaboration, and it was a really strong show of support from Africa to China. There were 51 heads of state that were present at that engagement, and South Africa had a huge delegation of its cabinet that was present for our presidential business summit. As a consequence, this means that we can therefore unlock capital via foreign direct institutions in China, leveraging the development institutions that we have on the continent, the likes of Development Bank of Southern Africa, African Finance Corporation, and the like, to form these linkages and allow that capital flow. So essentially leveraging capital from regions that have done this very successfully and using our domestic or continental institutions to do the vetting and the process of due diligence. And I think that's also another issue of contention when it comes to unlocking projects. What we find is that there is a shortage of development costs that are required to unlock these projects and get them to financial close. So that is some of the innovation that is required on the financing side to ensure that we can get more bankable projects and therefore get more traction on the continent. I'd like to finally mention that there are few organizations, both based in Southern Africa as well as in like you mentioned, Morocco, that are actively producing technical grade battery minerals as well as battery grade at a certain level and supplying that to global markets already. So it is happening on a small scale. And I think what the takeaway is that we do have the technical capability on the continent to do this. It just requires the right foundation and support from both the financing element as well as the technical partnerships in order to accelerate this process.
Thank you, Deshan. That was very clear. John, I'd love you to comment specifically on the fundamental point that Deshan raises, which really speaks to the heart of the opportunity. Deshan has referenced studies that show that it's considerably cheaper, or at least should be considerably cheaper, to produce goods manufactured from Africa's mineral reserves on the continent. In some, it's cheaper to produce here in Africa than it is in other regions of the world, and yet we're still struggling to attract the scale of capital that these projects require and to seize the opportunities presented by the global energy transition. There's risk inherent, of course, in all greenfield projects, but what role do you see institutions like the African Union playing in supporting member states to provide the necessary guarantees and risk mitigations that would enable capital to flow and to equip companies like Deshan's to develop downstream projects more cheaply than in other regions of the world? Can I invite you to comment on that, please, John?
Thank you very much, Marcos. To complement of Deshan's points, yes, there is a potential in Africa, and as I always said, the future is metallic, and metals are in Africa. So we in the continent we have a vision of Agenda 2063 that continues to be the vehicle of the continent towards the Africa we want by 2063. The African Union Commission and its institution is driving those aspirations to ensure a peaceful and prosperous Africa, well developed by its own citizen. And in that development, it requires sustainable minerals development, which is part of our future, because addressing the need for more sustainable future will require us to responsibly mine more raw materials than we ever in the past. And mining those materials might not be it's not a new aspect. It has been there for many years. So what vary is the skills and the technology that you are applying, because Africans succeeded in let's say, gold, for example. In many African countries, gold is processed to the level of 97%. Means we know how to process minerals. It wouldn't be very difficult with a specific focus on critical minerals or green minerals. I think it is a strategic shift on prioritizing some minerals. I'm a mining engineer. Minerals is mineral. I remember some years back when I was in the field, as a mining engineer, you design how to take out that minerals. But a policymaker can call it critical because it is critical for their industrialization. It can call it green because it resembles the aspiration of the climate change. Someone can say it is strategic because it is used for strategic purposes. But either way, minerals is a minerals, and Africans have the opportunity to use the current energy transition aspect to develop more responsible industries in the continent. Because there is no energy transition without those minerals. We would not have batteries, no electric cars, no wind turbines, even the solar panels. We brag sometimes about the sun in Africa, but the sun provides raw energy, but electricity flows through copper. Wind turbines need manganese or platinum or rare earth elements. Even the nuclear power requires uranium. But if you look at all these elements, they are all in Africa. That's why our proposition is Africa has the opportunity that it shouldn't miss in being a contributor in this energy transition. And it is possible. If we can do it with gold to the level of processing it to 97%, why not with lithium? So we are approaching our partners, international partners, to impact skills development in the continent where the world is moving towards building a greener future. We need knowledge to ensure that we are part of this energy transition to discover more opportunities and improve sustainability to reduce society impact on the environment as well. So Africa has opportunity that shouldn't miss, but the power lies on doing it collectively. And I remember, I think Dashan talked about the battery precursor in Zambia and DRC. That is only one example, because I believe minerals are borderless. It can be done collectively. Means if you have the same mineral occurrences in 2 or 3 African countries, those 3 African countries can put their resources together. They can put their infrastructure together to ensure that that mineral is processed in the continent or the higher value of it is extracted in the continent. So it is doable. So African Union has a convening power. We have that opportunity of leveraging the institutional capacity of the continental body to promote Africa in a better way as a partner in ensuring that the world is transiting equitably and also sustainably in a way that it provides also for the resource owner and the continent. So I strongly believe that Africa continent can be part of the solution, addressing the future resources demand in our world. And we have the opportunity that we don't miss, and we can do that collectively.
John, Deshan, thank you for sharing what you see as the potential. I think we know where we are as a continent and we know where we need to be, but there's some gaps in the middle between where we are and where we need to be. And John, you touched on something quite important, that Africa needs to work collectively together. And I want to expand on that just a little bit, because I think that's in my mind, one of the gaps that's preventing Africa from succeeding in this area. How do we get African countries to work closer together than they currently are? They tend to operate in silos or in pockets and think about themselves and not think about the collective objectives of the continent. And I think that's something that needs to happen. And then perhaps just following on from that, Deshan, you might want to comment on the fact that successful downstream industry, and Afrivault is in the process of doing that, requires multiple partners to come together. Mining tends to think about mining, and downstream value addition is a different sector. And somehow those two sectors need to figure out how to work together, and what is government's role in helping or facilitating that. So those are two things that have come up for me based on some of the insights that you've both shared. John, do you want to start by talking about the importance of Africa working collectively together as a continent and helping promote the objectives that we're talking about today?
Sure. I think we have a continental institution that bring the African member state together. There's the African Union and its institutions. It is an institution that can be leveraged by Africans to prioritize the continental project. And we have a great success in the African Union reaching far to join multinational institutions like the G20, trying to reform the United Nations, try to reform financial institutions like the World Bank, the African Monetary Fund. Those are institutions that can enable the capabilities of countries that have resources to move up the value chain. So I believe we have the opportunity, but we have to work together. bringing the African private sectors also to be part of that. We have tried to bring the private sector through ACMA initiative, where we are saying mining, it's an intensive work that require a lot of investment. It has a lot of risk, as you mentioned, but government alone can't do it. You need the private sector to be part of this. So it needs determination, commitment, and working together and collectively. Policies alone without proper investment cannot make a difference. We need to invest in those policies. And African Union Commission is trying to work with member states, with also private sector, to ensure that the policies we introduce are working. And we see it's a learning. We can learn from developed countries through partnership. And there's a great interest from many developed countries that want to invest in Africa. So how can we do it better to ensure that the needed transformation and development is achieved? So I believe African Union Commission has a key role working with the member states that have the actual resources in the ground, together with all the different stakeholders, the citizen, the private sector, the indigenous community, the investors, and also the international partners. So that cooperation is a key in success.
Thanks so much, John. And it's great for you to paint that picture of institutions and associations that are working together, that are supporting this vision, and knowing that it's not in its infancy stages really, but that there's been a lot of movement with regards to that collaboration. Now, Deshan, as I mentioned before, I think it's important that the private sector does come to the party, but still I wonder, between downstream value addition, beneficiation, and the mining industry, there for me is still that gap. And how do we bridge that gap between mining and downstream to come together, to work together, and obviously to do it in Africa?
Thanks, Laura. And I completely agree with you. There is a significant disjoint or gap between the extraction and the downstream value addition. But as I mentioned, there are a few examples, and to John's point, that have successfully done this and have become globally competitive organizations. In order to do this at a large scale, definitely, policy frameworks that support this at a country level as well as a continental level are important. And this sort of creates the circular element or this industry feedback loop, or the mining feedback loop that we talk about. If we're able to decarbonize mining activities, not only does that increase the competitiveness of products given the pressure for decarbonization globally, but it also results and necessitates more sustainable raw inputs into alternate industries. So essentially using mining as the catalyst to firstly drive the renewable energy generation, and then as a consequence also the energy storage that is required from that perspective. But the devil is in the detail, and some of the details are around these long-term contracts that are in place with off-takers of that mining concentrate or the raw ore, and how do governments then unlock or unwind these positions to ensure that there is a beneficiation that occurs on continent. That is one element. The second is in terms of infrastructure development for these emerging technologies. There's been a lot of focus on, for example, the lack of EV charging infrastructure globally to support electric vehicle adoption. But there are very innovative technologies that exist to combat these infrastructure challenges. And you're seeing at a very micro level, in terms of last mile delivery, a few projects where they have combated these issues around charging infrastructure with the implementation of battery swapping technologies. And not only does this drive and increase the demand for batteries, but it also addresses the issue with regard to range anxiety as well as charging time. So these are some of the emerging technologies that can be implemented on the continent. And it is important for government to be a participant in terms of not only an off-taker, but also an enabler from a policy perspective. So public transport initiatives and decarbonizing public transport really then becomes an important consideration to incentivize the downstream investment into these industries. So those are some of the high-level things that I think are important when talking about the challenges. But it is very much up to government to ensure that it is an enabling environment for foreign direct investment, and then also to try and support with regard to the offtake. In Africa, there's over 600 million people that do not have access to stable electricity. And if we're able to come up with innovative solutions where we're looking at microgrid or smart grid applications, not only does it drive the demand for minerals, but it also drives the demand for the downstream manufacturing of the energy storage solutions to unlock these sustainable futures.
I want to end my thoughts with one last question. And again, I want to pose it to you both. We've touched on the issue of policy multiple times during this conversation. Now, one of the things we've seen a lot of African governments do more recently, maybe over the last 2 years, is create export bans for some of their minerals with the intention of encouraging in-country beneficiation and downstream value addition. Now, obviously, the concept of doing that, in my mind, is absolutely right, but the method of how they're going about it perhaps gives somewhat of a desire for a better way. Deshan, what is your view on how governments are utilizing the notion of export bans to encourage downstream value addition? And John, would love to have your feedback and thoughts on this comment as well.
Thanks, Laura. I agree. It can be a very binary outcome by implementing such harsh measures. But that being said, historically, the continent is very much known for the scratch patch of the world when it comes to minerals and mineral resources. And in order to unlock our positions here, I think a firmer stance is required, maybe not the magnitude that is currently being adopted, because at the end of the day, in order to progress this industry, it is my firm belief that technical relationships and strategic partnerships are paramount. There's no way that we can unlock battery processing or battery mineral processing to battery grade at 99.999% purity without the support and the backing of countries that have done this in a very successful manner. And the point I'm making here, as I mentioned in the initial response, is that China processes north of 95% of all battery minerals globally. They produce north of 70% of all batteries globally. And as a consequence, it is important to have them as strategic partners and to unlock this downstream beneficiation. I spoke to the major outcome from FOCAC being that Asia and China in general, or China and Asia in general, is looking towards creating sustainable win-win partnerships. And they're now realizing that it is important to develop local economies or regional economies to support their own growth, as well as the opportunity to play the geopolitical game and still supply product into the Western regions. So I think there has definitely been a shift in mentality and mindset from the extraction and exportation model. What it now requires is unlocking the development capital for these greenfield projects. And there's a multitude of green financing initiatives that can be deployed on the continent. We're seeing examples of this in the developed world, in the West, where you have green bonds and the like that are being used to facilitate financing for these projects. And what we need is more of that on the African continent and more first-class capital that is going towards the project development stage of these infrastructure type projects to get them to financial close. So, yeah, I think to summarize, it is definitely, a carrot and stick situation. And sometimes, depending on the situation, either one is needed. But in order to unlock this and for it to be sustainable, it very much needs to be a collaborative approach where we're showing value to all parties involved in this ecosystem.
Thanks, Deshan. I think the notion of collaboration is so important in so many factors of what we're discussing, including what we're saying today. John, just an opportunity to perhaps comment on what Deshan has said, and also from the lens that you wear in your role that you play, your thoughts around the notion of not even the notion, the implementation of banning material exports in order to encourage downstream beneficiation.
Yes, to comment on that, the raw material export ban, as I mentioned earlier, that minerals are geographically located, and most of them comes with sovereignty of states. So, and that led to decision of some countries saying we don't want to export the raw materials and so on. As Deshan mentioned, the export ban by itself might not immediately guarantee the mineral beneficiation and value addition in that specific country. So it has to be accompanied with forward-looking policies that look at the overall partnership in realizing that specific vision of adding value. So for me, the banning of the export alone is not enough. It has to be accompanied with workable policies and equitable partnership. Of course, African Union have introduced policies that can be a guide to member states. The African Mining Vision and its implementation instruments, they are a foundation, they are a starting point for countries who really want to revive their national laws and regulation in mining development.
Thank you, John. I think I'm going to bring us to a close now, if I may. I want to thank you, John, and you, Deshan, for the insights that you've given us. The opportunity that you've presented for critical minerals processing and beneficiation is considerable, but so too is the delta between that opportunity and the reality today. Bridging this gap is going to require intentionality on the part of AU member states, intentionality to transform their economies from exporters of raw materials with little or no value addition taking place on the continent to competitive processing and manufacturing hubs. And the interventions that are required to bridge this gap are by no means insurmountable, but they do require vision, courage, and conviction. And they require partnerships too, as you have both been at pains to point out. And they're going to require creative finance, innovative instruments such as green bonds and concessional finance and incentives in the way that you've referred to, Deshan. So we have a picture of just how complex these value chains and just how many interventions are required. We've got a sense of just how much political will is required as well. We can see the future state, and that future state should be tantalizing for all of us who live and work on the continent. We know it takes time, but that it requires urgency if the African continent is to benefit from the opportunities that are inherent in the global energy transition. So it just leaves me to thank Deshan, to thank John, and to thank my co-host Laura for expertly navigating us through this topic. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.